Last year, I set up a pair of old dynamo crank phones as a shop intercom, and in that video I mentioned how it was part of the design effort for Alexis's living room. Well, months before that, I had actually started on another element, and now, over a full year later, I've actually finished it. See, there's this light tube which provides much of the illumination in the living room during the day. It even now provides illumination at night, after we realized there was actually a full light fixture inside, it just wasn't wired up to anything. So now it's kind of awkwardly wired up to be on the same switch as the kitchen light. But wouldn't it be cool as part of this whole hyper-saturated Edwardian parlor vibe if we added some stained glass? Maybe a globe? But only half a globe, so it just protrudes from the ceiling like a light fixture. Maybe a bit less than half a globe, since the ceiling isn't that tall? What about everything from the Tropic of Capricorn down to the South Pole? Not a hemisphere, but the official term would be spherical cap, which sounds pretty silly and no one knows what it means, so we'll just informally call it a hemisphere anyway? Yeah, that sounded pretty cool. The only problem was, I had no experience working with stained glass, so I was going to have to learn. Though, when I was about 15 years old, I did pick up an old glass cutting kit at a yard sale. Cut the tops off of bottles to make funnels, that kind of stuff. And it sucked. I never got the glass to crack cleanly, which left me with an impression that I just wasn't good at working with glass. But it turns out that a couple decades of experience learning skills, plus investing in some equipment that isn't literal trash, helps a lot. I still wouldn't say I'm great at it, but I've definitely become quite comfortable with cutting glass through the course of this project. I've got a much better sense of what will and won't work, which is an important step. At first I just bought cheap samplers of glass online and started working on small throwaway projects. I tried several variations playing with the square root of 2 ratio, which I thought worked nicely with random pieces of glass, and the later spiral versions helped me get a good sense of working with curves. It also let me learn about the first main modality of assembling stained glass, foil tape. You attach adhesive-backed copper tape to the edges of the pieces, burnishing it down for good adhesion. Then you just solder them together. Applying the tape evenly is a bit tricky, and it's not fast, but it's a very approachable technique and almost universally the way everyone starts. Soon I was feeling comfortable enough to attempt my first real project. Let's talk about Penrose tilings. They have the very neat property that they can continue infinitely, perfectly tiling the plane without leaving any gaps, yet without ever repeating. For certain definitions of repeating anyway. I've always loved them, but most decorative uses keep the pattern centered, highlighting the bilateral symmetry, like this related quasi-crystal pattern on the Physics Astronomy building at the University of Washington. I think that kind of detracts from the non-repeating aspect, so let's slide over an X until we can't see that anymore. Great. But it still feels like we could accentuate the weirdness of the tiling better. What if we do a stochastic gradient from one side to the other, randomly choosing tiles to be one of 2 colors randomly, according to a simple Gaussian distribution? Oh yeah, that's the stuff. I've used this before, most notably in an installation to catch the world at Seattle Center a few years back, turning 1/4-inch weathering steel plates into delicate non-repeating lattices. The middle panel is the same idea, just with a probability distribution applied according to the distance from the center. It's a pattern I've yet to grow tired of, so let's do it in glass. I started with some clear and frosted glass, to go for a very subtle contrast. Using printed guides under the glass, I cut the tiles as best I could to shape. At first this seemed to be working okay, but as I started to assemble a full sheet, it became obvious that I needed to be a lot more precise in cutting the tiles. For the second attempt I changed a few things. I scaled up the design because the previous tiles had been a bit too small to work with comfortably. I bought some new glass in large sheets and more vibrant colors from Covenant Art Glass up in Everett. They were always happy to answer all my random questions, and have the nice property of being very easily reached via transit from the shop. I used the household vinyl cutter to create template stickers that would very precisely show when a piece was too big or too small. And I borrowed a glass grinding tool from a friend who had gone through their own stained glass phase previously. You can do this with manual tools, but it takes a lot more work, and it's harder to keep everything wet as you do so. Wet is good because it means no glass dust is in the air, which means no pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis. Fun word, unfun condition. I also got caught in a bit of a tangent at this point, because I started to play with a 3D printed foiling tool to help apply the foil tape quickly, keeping it centered on the edge of the glass. And it never really worked for me, but I kept thinking of ways to improve it. I wanted something desk-mounted, so I'd have an extra hand free. I wanted the tape to be stripped of its backing and then rolled upside down, so the sticky side was always facing out. This bend turned out to have a good amount of friction, so I added a ball bearing of the correct width, which made the action a lot smoother. But then the standard tape spool holder wasn't feeding the tape out in the correct orientation anymore. And also, since the spool was just sitting in a slot, there was still a lot of friction in the system to prevent it from smoothly feeding out. What if it was sitting on more ball bearings, with a series of yet more ball bearings to feed it out in the orientation I wanted? A couple iterations, and I had this, my improved and definitely not over-engineered tape dispenser. And then, looking back at the foiling tool itself, I realized that while I might theoretically be working with 1/8" thick glass, in practice the thickness varied quite a bit, particularly with the more interesting art glasses. So either I could make the slot wide enough that everything fit, at which point most wouldn't have their tape centered very well, or I could make it narrow enough so that most would center well but some wouldn't fit at all. Or I could add an opposed left-right screw mechanism and dowel pin guides to have a fully adjustable slot, with jaws that move in and out with ease. In practice, I never got them to stay entirely parallel, but most of the action is at the top of the slot anyway, so it works fairly well. On larger, more convex pieces anyway. It can only handle shallow concavities. Once those get too deep, you're back to doing it manually. But for repetitive convex tiles like in the Penrose tiling, it really shined. I'll include a link for the STLs for these in the description if you want to print your own. Back to the second Penrose tiling. With tiles cut using the vinyl templates and ground right up to the line, and foiled using the new foiling tool, it came together a lot nicer. I even bothered to add a nice zinc frame to finish it off properly. This was the first of the projects I actually put up on display instead of immediately chucking in the scrap pile. I was starting to build some confidence, but I didn't feel quite up to the globe idea yet. Something else I had been thinking of, though, were those Letterforms by Albrecht Dürer, where he tried to provide some constructive geometry for classic Latin letters. These are so endlessly referenced that they're a bit trite at this point, but I do think it's one of those cases where it's referenced so much simply because it's really cool. These come from his On the Just Forming of Letters, which also includes instructions for the more scribal forms of the Gothic alphabet. But this is all just a small excerpt of his book Institutionem Geometricarum, which looks to have some really interesting content in it, at least if you're into exploring pre-algebraic forms of mathematics like I am. It also nicely highlights his personal sigil, which absolutely rules and was like 300 years ahead of its time. It also talks about urban planning, apparently, but it's all written in Latin, and only the Just Forming of Letters seems to have ever been translated. As my pronunciation above might have hinted, I've never learned Latin. So if there are any classicists in the audience looking for a project... Anyway, what about doing a stained glass piece using one of those Latin letterforms, where the seams between the glass tiles are the construction lines? His are actually pretty sparse, being a practical tool and not just for aesthetics, but I could complicate as needed. The thing was, though, what letter? I wasn't sure I wanted to do something with my initials. That felt a little grade school. Also, the M and the D aren't that interesting. But then I realized, wait, I have a 2-year-old nephew. This kind of thing makes way more sense for a small child. I'll do a big J for Jamie. The only problem was that Dürer was doing this for the classical Latin alphabet. And, as you might remember,
J.
Latin didn't have a J. So I made it my own. And I kept it honest, working from a constructible grid, subdivided into half steps in some places. All the circles are centered on those intersections, with integer radii. I did feel like the full grid was a bit dense though, so I removed some of the lines to get the vibe I was looking for. Artistic license, don't you know? The glass I was working with was a cloudy white background for a paper-esque feel, with a bold blue for the letterform itself. I even tried to align the natural texture of the blue glass with the shape of the J to give it a calligraphic brushstroke feel. I followed the same procedures as before, cutting with vinyl templates and grinding up to the line. And I was happy with the result, but I wanted to do something a bit more special for the assembly. Time to explore the second modality, lead came. This is what you think of with traditional stained glass, like in a cathedral or something. The glass tiles are held in little H-shaped channels of lead, which are only soldered together where they intersect. And it is lead came with an M, not lead cane like I'd always thought. Lead came. That's just how it is. You can buy straight sections at a local store, or get a roll from online, but in either case you need to stretch it before using it. This makes it noticeably longer and a lot stiffer. You can do this with a little clamp screwed into the wall, but if you've got a vise mounted on an inch-thick fabrication table, I can attest that works quite nicely as well. With the came straightened, you can start cutting and bending it to shape. And this, it turns out, is incredibly fiddly if your design is at all complicated. Cutting the came at anything other than a 90-degree angle without squishing it completely out of shape is a challenge. After trying several different techniques, I mostly ended up using the special side cutters. These are actually made for cutting lead. Note how much sharper the cutting edge is compared to normal wire cutters. But that means they'd immediately dull if used on anything harder than lead. You've also got to keep the partial assembly clamped firmly together the entire time, or it just falls apart. The traditional solution is to use square nails on a wood table, but push pins in a thick cork sheet work okay too. I did some practice runs on yet more broken spirals until I thought I was ready for the J, and I still felt overwhelmed with the change in scale. I went through a lot of came making this work, so order several times more than you think you'll need. The tapering joints around the circles were particularly hard, as the inner web had to be cut away separately or else it wouldn't sit snugly around the glass. But after a week or two of frustration, I finally had a complete piece. Soldering came together is a lot easier to get looking good than the foil tape technique at least. Just hold the iron over their joint briefly and move on. It does take a lot of heat though. I had to get a special soldering iron just for glasswork, as my normal one was useless even dialed all the way up. Once the piece was fully assembled, I added some metal hooks on either side so it could be hung on a wall. And that was it for the soldering, but it wasn't done yet, because unlike with the foil tape technique, where the glass all ends up firmly embedded in channels of frozen solder, with lead came they're just loosely resting in extruded channels. They rattle, and the whole thing flexes a bit alarmingly. And if this was supposed to be used as a window, it's nowhere near being weathertight. So the final step is cementing, where you mix linseed oil with a cement mixture to create a surprisingly delicious smelling paste. This gets smeared all over the piece, pushing it down into the cracks between all the elements. Messy, but kind of fun. Then you sprinkle on whiting powder, which makes the remnants dry up and crumble away. Then you let it cure, but make sure you properly dispose of any rags or paper towels that have linseed oil on them. The thing is, linseed oil polymerizes as it oxidizes. That makes it perfect for uses like this, or for protecting wood, or for making linoleum or something. Anytime you want a tough but flexible substance, and maybe synthetic petroleum products haven't been invented yet. But it's an exothermic process, which means it spontaneously heats up as it happens. Sometimes to the point of bursting into flame. I burned the paper towels I used to clean up from above in the fireplace, and it gives a pretty good sense of how dramatic a linseed oil fire can become very quickly. As you might imagine, this has been the source of a lot of fires over the years. Infamously, a skyscraper fire in Philadelphia was started this way, killing 3 firefighters and almost taking down the entire building. So, just to make sure you dispose of everything properly, okay? Anyway, I was quite happy with the J letterform piece, and felt like maybe it was time to start on the actual project, the globe hemisphere / spherical cap. Like many of my ill-conceived ideas, I first turned to Blender. I found a globe model and extracted just the landmasses below the Tropic of Capricorn. And yes, I was extra careful not to forget New Zealand. Then I wrote a script to generate a matching tessellated hemisphere, with edges every 15 degrees of latitude or longitude. Since these were getting too narrow at the South Pole, the final section from 75 degrees south to 90 is subdivided by every 45 degrees of longitude, giving it 8 tiles to circle the pole. Then I intersected the landmasses with a tessellation and started cleaning it up. My goal was to have every seam in the stained glass be either a coastline or one of the selected lines of longitude or latitude. Practically speaking, this did mean I had to fudge some of the shapes, to avoid things like this impossibly narrow strip of ocean between the Antarctic Peninsula and West 60 degrees. But the real challenge were the true islands, Tasmania and the North Island of New Zealand. These both fell solidly within their respective tiles, and while there are ways to pierce glass with a diamond burr grinder, I had absolutely no confidence I could do it. And the ocean around Tierra del Fuego was possibly even worse. How could I possibly expect to cut that with my skills? Cheat with modern technology, of course. Having put in the effort to learn some manual skills, I now wanted to see how far I could push things when completely unconstrained. I would simply have them cut on a water jet machine. I had a quick test run of the South American wedge laser cut in acrylic, just to confirm the process generally worked. Then I set about looking for a local water jet supplier who might be willing to take the job. And I discovered something pretty neat. There is a makerspace down in North Seattle, the North End Makerspace, and in addition to being a generally well-equipped and friendly makerspace, they have a Wazer machine. These are the prosumer-level desktop water jets, basically trying to do for water jet what Glowforge did for laser cutters. I had vaguely looked about maybe getting one myself someday, but while they're considerably cheaper than a full industrial system, they're still very expensive. Like new mill expensive. I was pretty excited at the opportunity to get to use one, so I joined the makerspace and got certified. For those new to the tech, water jets are actually pretty simple. A very high pressure jet of water carries abrasive garnet powder with it, cutting through basically anything you put under it. Glass, steel, granite, and most certainly your flimsy flesh body if you're not careful. I do kind of love working with equipment that has cards like this to take to the ER with you in case of an accident. The workpiece doesn't need to be electrically conductive like with a plasma cutter, and there is no heat affected zone as there is no heat. You can even do partial cuts for scoring metal plates to bend in the specific spot. That's how I made the 2015 Hugo bases. But that's even more messy than normal cutting, which is already quite messy, and not every supplier allows it, including this makerspace. Anyway, it's been a favorite fabrication technology of mine for ages at this point, and now I feel like I have a much better intuition for what will and won't work. This is where the project started to experience some time dilation. I'd blame it on getting distracted by other projects, but looking through my photo log up until this point, I had already been working on half a dozen other projects the whole time. For whatever reason, the rounds of prototyping started to get farther and farther apart. I figured out a good spacing to allow for the copper foil, which worked out to be 0.5 millimeters on all sides. I printed a jig to hold a 45-degree wedge of tiles at the correct orientation for soldering, and did a complete test in scrap glass with the Eastern Australia to New Zealand wedge. We even went and bought the art glass for the ocean and land and ice cap tiles. And then months passed. But after getting back from the SF Bay trip, I started to get serious about it again. I did a complete new generation of the tiles, putting in everything I had learned. This included things like exaggerating the size of certain elements, such as the aforementioned islands and the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, so they wouldn't get completely lost in the solder borders. And I did more test runs on the Wazer, figuring out things like better ways to attach the glass to the bed of the machine. The basic technique is just to screw things down directly to the bed, which is itself a consumable. The eponymous jet of water doesn't push things around too much itself, but when it hits the tank of water under the bed, it splashes back up, sometimes quite unpredictably and quite forcibly. So thin sheets of things like glass have to be secured pretty firmly. But you just can't screw down glass that tightly. I often had sheets crack in half during the cutting process. I saw in Pask Makes' stained glass video that when he was using his personal Wazer, jealous, he hot glued the sheets of glass to some scrap coroplast, which then got screwed down to the bed. I tried this, and it worked once, but on the second the entire sheet of glass delaminated from the coroplast. I think maybe he has a better hot glue gun than I do. Or maybe it's because I skipped the blue tape? I don't know. Eventually I cut some simple oversized washers out of the rubber strips I bought for making the cargo bike lid watertight, and this worked pretty well. Not perfectly, but well enough. The ocean tiles were numerous but simple. I just broke down a large sheet into more manageable pieces of a standard size, and set up the cut files to all use that. It's a very light, transparent blue. Not much character, but since most of the world is ocean, particularly the southern half, we wanted to make sure it didn't block or overly tint the light coming through. But for the ice cap and land tiles, it could be a bit more interesting. The ice caps were cloudy, streaky white, which I tried to cut so the streaks would mostly be aligned north-south. That is, radially, since we're talking about one of the poles. The land was all from a gorgeous sheet of green-brown art glass. I tried to align each landmass so that the greens and browns would reflect the actual biomes, but I wasn't entirely successful. Setting the origin for a cut is hard to be precise with, particularly since the Wazer jog function doesn't have any way to move under a full centimeter at a time. At least that I could find, and it's not like there's that many buttons for it to be a hidden feature. Australia ended up quite misaligned, making it look a lot more green than it has any right to. Sorry. I at least got the line of bright green for the windward side of the Cordillera in South America pretty well. This has been a wet winter even for the Pacific Northwest, but after a week or two of irregular late-night bike rides down to the makerspace, space to take advantage of what few weather windows there were, I had all the tiles cut. The first step of assembly was just more foil tape application. A lot more. I do like the lead came look better, but there was just no way to make it work with pieces this small and fiddly. Tiffany didn't invent the copper foil technique, but there is a good reason he is so closely associated with it. His lamp designs wouldn't have been possible without it. It's lighter, stronger, and can capture a lot more detail. So I foiled and I foiled. Oh, and I had eye surgery, but that didn't stop me from more foiling. And then the soldering. I used the jig to tack each 45-degree wedge together, being careful to flip the pieces as I loaded them. We're looking at them from inside the Earth now, so everything has to be backwards from this perspective. The jig was also helpful combining the octants into quarters, and the quarters into halves. I freehanded the final unification, but that was a very constrained problem at that point, and it all went together pretty easily. And what a relief that was. Getting a tessellated sphere to join together cleanly is a real challenge sometimes. Because it wraps around onto itself, errors just stack and stack and stack with nowhere to hide them. With the full hemisphere tacked together, all that was left was a lot of soldering to fill in the joints. I finished with just a couple hours left in 2025, though obviously there was a lot of work left to do before making this video, such as mounting it to the ceiling. I had originally intended to hang it from a long pipe nipple, the way most light fixtures do, but that was before getting up in there and realizing how wobbly the existing fixture is, cantilevered out into the middle like that. There was no way I was going to get the dome to sit flush against the ceiling that way, unless I extended the support out to the other side of the tube. And even then I'd have to cut a hole in the weather seal and the diffuser plate, and the pipe itself would be way more visible inside the dome than I had been imagining, to the point of being distracting. So that was rejected, and I had to fill in the hole at the pole with one last little tile. Instead, I decided to use the mounting system already present on the tube for the diffuser plate, a kind of 6-tab bayonet mount. And the easiest way to do that was just to use a diffuser plate designed for that exact purpose. I probably could have machined something, but the diameter was just a bit too big for the swing of my lathe, and I didn't like the idea of sharp metal edges chewing away at the plastic tabs anyway. I wanted to keep this as non-destructive as possible. So I ordered a replacement diffuser plate, plus some metal ring segments. These had to be welded together, and nuts welded to that. I really should get one of those tools that can crimp or spot weld threaded inserts into place. The ring was just mild steel, as getting it done in copper was like 4 times as expensive, so I had to wrap it in 1-inch copper foil tape before soldering. With that done, soldering the hemisphere to it was fairly easy. It was at this point that I started playing with lighting the hemisphere with some filming lights, just to see how it looked lit up, and I realized something that maybe should have been more obvious. When you're making a predominantly glass object, the insides remain visible. So I decided to at least tin the inner joints, and then give them a black patina to not be as visible. I was already planning to do that for the outside solder joints anyway. This meant cleaning all the solder joints to remove the flux, and lightly rubbing them with steel wool to remove the oxide layer. The patina solution is nitric acid and selenium compounds, much like a cold bluing solution. Unfortunately, the jar I was using was quite old, and I just got this ugly, blotchy brown. But that's why I did the inside first. I ordered a new bottle, and it worked well enough that time to do the outside as well. Finally, I cut some felt strips to glue on the inside lip of the metal ring the hemisphere was soldered to, as it wasn't particularly pretty. Not a very elegant solution, but it worked. And I've got yards of felt sitting in my closet, left over from the LEGO Apollo project, when I recreated Apollos 11, 13, and 15 in LEGO, posted in real time, exactly 50 years to the minute after the original events. And the project was done. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Some of the tiles cracked, which is a bummer, particularly this bit around Tasmania. I put so much effort into making it actually an island, and now there are lines connecting it again. And I don't love the solder job, but at least the patina hides it to some degree. As always, I can only see the flaws. Oh well, c'est ma vie. I'm not sure how much stained glass work I'll do in the future, but probably more than 0. And even if I don't, I think the result was worth the effort. The next video will probably be on a little project I've been working on to highlight gray codes, different ways to enumerate every possible binary value without repeats and only changing a single bit at a time. And I've started doing some serious design work on an idea that has been bouncing around my head for decades: modular cells for a physical implementation of Conway's life. You can blame John Conway for that one, obviously, as well as David Brin. But as always, I don't pretend to be in charge of my muse, so who knows? Whatever it is, I'll see you then. Cheers. Oh, and at the last minute, I realized I could push the bounds a bit further. I present inverse stained glass. Normal stained glass is glass held within a matrix of metal, right? Well, this is metal held within a matrix of glass. It's really dumb.